Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to Life with GDPR, a podcast where I work in conjunction with Jonathan Armstrong, partner at Cordery Compliance in London, and a well-known data privacy, data protection expert. In this part 3 of a 3-part series on the top 10 lessons from the first year of GDPR, we discuss why you should always remember to remediate and then report to the appropriate agencies. Do not disrespect a SAR or a DPA, as that can get you in serious trouble. You should keep logs in case you have to revisit a decision. And then finally, always debrief and take lessons learned going forward. I hope you were able to join us for parts 1 and 2 of our 3-part series. If not, please check them out. Life with GDPR is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, along with Jonathan Armstrong, back for another episode of Life with GDPR. Jonathan, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Jonathan, we are at our final episode of a 3-part series of lessons learned, or at least some information you've garnered over the past 12 months or so since GDPR has gone live. And I wanted to start today with an interesting phrase that you utilize, which is remediate, then report.
Yes, so I think this is somewhat counterintuitive. So just to give you some background behind this, we've been working on a tool and a system to help organizations manage data breaches. And we've looked at about a year's worth of data breach activity across Europe prior to GDPR coming in. And then we've looked at most of the cases where we can find some sort of public reports pre-GDPR in the year or so, post-GDPR in the year or so post-GDPR. And obviously, we handle a lot of breaches ourselves at Cordery on behalf of clients. And we've looked at the things that we think make a difference between regulators taking aggressive enforcement action versus them not. And in some cases, regulators decided that the corporation's response is proportionate and there's no need for anything to be made public. And that, in some respects, is the holy grail. If you can find an informal resolution with a regulator that doesn't involve the breach being more public than it is, then that's the aim for many corporations. And we found that the corporation's willingness to remediate what went wrong prior to making a report can be a key factor in that decision from a regulator. But to do that, you'll need to act quickly because obviously, we talked about it on our last chat, Tom, you've 72 hours in most cases to make a report to a regulator. So the corporation will have to come to an awareness quickly that it could have done something better. It'll have to have thought through how it can stop that bad thing happening again. And in most cases, we'd like them to start implementing that remediation plan. So it's important to show that you've learned lessons. It's important to look at prior regulatory interventions, to look at what regulators have asked people to do publicly in similar situations. And it's obviously important to try and do the right thing. Now, you can use software like we would do to try and suggest what might be appropriate actions, or you can do that review yourself. There are obviously some key learnings, I think, from the cases that I could perhaps share here with maybe 3 really easy principles. Firstly, I think don't try and chip the victims. So we've seen in one breach, for example, where the corporation that had committed the breach said, we are going to have an online tool for you to work out whether you're affected by the breach. So that's probably a good thing. But to access the online tool, you had to agree to their contractual terms, which said that you would not sue them and that your only remedy would be arbitration. in an arbitration system controlled by the corporation that had caused the breach. And you also had to submit more data to them to find out whether they'd lost the first lot of data. Now, understandably, people are reluctant to do that. You know, if you just lost 8 things about me, I don't want to give you my passport as well so that you can also lose that. So you've got to play right by the victims. Don't try and chip them. Don't try and impose new contractual terms. Realize the fact that you've let people down. My sub-step 2, I think, would be look for the simple as well. Sometimes it isn't a super sophisticated solution to stop bad things happening. So, for example, if somebody has lost papers in a briefcase, then why not think about encouraging everybody in the business to apply locks to their briefcases? If you use one of those laptop bags with a circle at the end of the zipper, you can put a padlock through that. It'll cost you about $1.50, and that might reduce the number of data breaches you have and the number of data breaches that you need to report. Because whilst any criminal could snap the lock, if you can retrieve the briefcase with the lock still intact, many regulators will be assured that it's unlikely that the details in the briefcase were compromised. And then, as I said, sometimes things are easy and you can start them straight away. So that might be things like patch management, if it's a software vulnerability, which has been a feature in many cases, you know, Expedia, British Airways. Or it might be new training for individuals concerned. If there's a team of only 8 people that have lost the data, then take them offline, retrain them, put in place some quick, to-the-point training, then allow them to have their access back. When you make the report to the regulator, tell the regulator that you've done that, and you will score some credibility points with the regulator. In most cases, I think regulators are wanting to take a proportionate view. So if you can show them what went wrong, what you learned, and how you're going to fix it, then you're helping them do their job to make data more secure.
So, Jonathan, the next point you have is don't diss the DPA.
Yeah, we've seen quite a lot of cases where people have decided almost to take on the regulator. I always find this quite surprising. You know, we've been involved with cases where we haven't agreed with the regulator's result, or we haven't agreed with the regulator's reasoning, but you still have to show respect. To give you some examples, the TalkTalk case I've talked about on one of our earlier chats, where an individual at the business said, you know, I'll decide when it's a breach, not you. That's not a good thing to say to a regulator. If they've decided there's an incident, you could say things like, we don't view it as seriously as you do, or we're working through it. But I don't think that you should say black when the regulator thinks white. We've had another example in Cambridge Analytica. This wasn't a data breach case in this instance. It was a case around subject access requests. But in that case, a US individual asked a UK entity exercised his subject access requests, and the reply from the entity involved was that the US individual had no more rights than a member of the Taliban sitting in a cave in Afghanistan. Now, this isn't the sort of language that you should use when dealing with regulatory matters. I don't need to tell anybody that on this podcast. But to make matters worse, when the regulator involved and sort of said that, the corporation said that they did not expect to be further harassed with this sort of correspondence from the regulator. So, you know, you can make a bad situation worse. Well done for those executives at those 2 corporations who did do that. But it's important to remember that whenever regulators are looking at a data breach, they're unlikely to be looking just at the data breach. So we've seen that false promises are somewhat common. You know, there's a Hilton case, for example, in the US, Equifax again, the BA case, where people have said, you know, your data will be safe with us, your data will stay in X, Y, Z location. So it might be that you've also breached the transparency requirements as well as the security requirements under GDPR. So you need to take a cautious approach, I think, whenever you're talking to a regulator. They hold most of the cards, so show them respect. Even if you disagree with their decisions, there are review processes in GDPR, there are appeal processes. You can suggest politely to a regulator that you don't agree. You can even ask the regulator to review their decision, but I'd suggest that's an appropriate time to get specialist counsel involved if you haven't already, to walk you through the risks of that approach and be polite and respectful. Regulators don't go away just because you use bad language.
Jonathan, that sort of response, I would say, is typical in the United States. Do you see U.S. or at least non-UK companies as the ones really employing this sort of attack response, or is it UK companies as well?
No, UK companies as well. The two examples I've given you are both UK entities. I'd like to blame, you know, people in another country, but it's my fellow countrymen who are responsible in these cases. In the BA case, two senior executives also made public statements after the notice of intention to fine. Let's just say I wouldn't have made public statements in the same terms. We'll eventually decide who was right and who was wrong. It's important to stress it's a notice of intent to fine at this stage. So we don't have the final news on the BA story. But I think in most cases, you've got to be very cautious with your response. As I said, it's legitimate to disagree with a regulator, but I think you need to do that with a certain finesse.
The next thoughts you had, Jonathan, were keep logs. Why is this important in the data privacy, data protection world?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when you've gone through your analysis, as I said, if you're encouraging people to report incident, you might determine that it wasn't as bad as you thought it was. But keeping logs are important because you might need to revisit that decision. So let's say, for example, you had an episode where there was something looked untoward on your website, you investigated, and you saw that no data was lost, then it might be legitimate to close the investigation down if you're sure that you've taken the right steps. And you would document in your log that you'd done an investigation and you didn't think data had been extracted. But there might come a day when you think, well, hang on, does this pot of data on the internet or on the dark web or whatever? The only real explanation was that it came from this episode that we had last March, let's say. It'll be important then to look at the logs. You're likely going to have to reach out to a regulator, and they're going to say, what did you do last March when you first had inkling? So it's important that you have this rationale laid out for the decisions you took at that time. And regulators can ask to see those logs at any time. Again, from our point of view, we're of the belief that for most corporations, you might need an automated process for that. We've designed one that we're using with some people, which gives a full audit log. So if you provision decide to report to a regulator and then you change your mind, it'll date stamp that decision. It'll say who made the decision and why. And that level of granularity, I think, will be very useful. And obviously, you'll also need logs to report up the organization. a lot of organizations now have boards that are engaged with security incidents, and they will want to know metrics. How many incidents have we had? They'll want to include near misses. They'll want to include lessons learned. So keeping a proper log will enable you to pull those metrics down when you're asked for them as well. And a lot of the work around data breach probably sits with people other than the compliance officer as a responsibility. So you'll want, colleagues to manage the data protection impact assessment process, for example. But the nature of the logs and who's keeping them and the system is probably something that the compliance officer will want to be intimately involved with, because that might feed up into all sorts of other reporting obligations as well. So you want a proper oversight as to what's being logged and the evidential value, if you like, of those logs as well.
So Jonathan, I often use the phrase document, meaning whatever you do, document it, because if you haven't documented it, in a regulator's eyes, it never happened. Keep logs seem to be something a little bit different. Would that be a fair assessment?
No, I think it's somewhat similar. I think the more documentation you have, particularly contemporaneous notes, particularly almost audit log type data that a system can hold for you, on who made the decision, why and when. I think all of that documentation will help you. And remember, of course, that regulators can knock on the door at any time under GDPR. We're starting to see these unannounced inspections. Some might call them dawn raids. It's very hard to get metrics, but there have maybe been 300 or 400 across Europe. And they are going to be more likely. Regulators are going to knock on the door and ask to see logs like this. So make sure that you have them ready in a form that reassures them. So,
Jonathan, for your final point, you left us with the phrase debrief and learn. Is that rinse, wash, and repeat, or something different?
Yeah, I think it is a little bit like that. I think that after a data breach, whether you've reported it to a regulator or not, it's important that you sit down and look at lessons. You might have already done some remediation, but it's probably a good idea to revisit the remediation plan as well. Is there anything we can add? Oftentimes you're making decisions, particularly if you are reporting to a regulator in 72 hours, you've made, maybe 200 decisions in that 3-day period. Oftentimes you'll need a day off for people to sit and reflect. Is there anything we could do better? Is there anything we need in place for the next time it happens? As I've said, data breaches are a when, not if for most organizations. Even the best run organizations with the best procedures will have breaches, in part because they employ humans and humans do cause breaches. So I think there's an old Chinese proverb that says, even on a journey of 1,000 miles, it's important that we sometimes look back at where we've been. And I think that is important in data breaches as well. We need to look at what the past teaches us about our future behaviors. What did we learn from this data breach or this incident that will help us make sure it doesn't happen again? Or if it does happen again, that we're ready for it. So it's important to have that period of reflection to get the team together. Using my A-team analogy, get the van out of the garage, sit in the van one last time and work out what could have happened that would have improved the situation for next time around.
Jonathan, that sounds suspiciously close to the term continuous improvement. And certainly in the anti-corruption world, the regulators are really forcing companies, or at least asking companies, to look more closely at their continuous improvement. And did you have a system in place that would have prevented the breach, whatever that breach might be? Is the debrief and learn something that you see the GDPR regulators really emphasizing, or is that simply too new, or GDPR going live really too new for them to focus on continuous improvement at this point?
I think it's too new at this point. I mean, obviously, we haven't had a lot of public stuff about the same organization suffering multiple breaches. I think there are likely questions like that being asked at the moment. If you put a gun to my head, I could probably name a couple of organizations that are having those discussions now. But those discussions will be going on between regulators and people who've had breaches. We know that many regulators are looking not only at breaches individually, but also at patterns. So I know at least one corporation has been approached by a regulator who said, "You've reported a number of breaches to us. We've agreed the significance of each one, but now we're going to have a chat about volume. Are you learning from your mistakes?" So we know that those discussions are taking place. As far as I know, none of those summits, if you like, are public yet, but I think that's only a matter of time.
So, Jonathan, this has really been a fascinating exploration of not only some of the lessons learned, but really things that people can put in place today and going forward. So I look forward to seeing what the next 12 to 18 months come up with for additional lessons. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Tom, as well. Nice to speak to you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series that Jonathan Armstrong and I have engaged in on lessons learned from the first year of GDPR going live. If you'd like more information, you can email Jonathan at jonathan.armstrong@corderycompliance.com. I've also linked to several resources on the Cordery site, which are great for your help in implementing GDPR compliance. I hope you will join Jonathan and I again, where we explore upcoming topics on Life with GDPR, which is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Who put a tender pitch in who didn't win, et cetera, et cetera. So some malicious whistleblower claims are certainly on the uptick as well. So the regretting news is, I think, Tom, that it's something that everyone's going to have to do a very careful assessment. There are no hard and fast rules, but they are going to have to balance the rights of potential victims against the rights of the individuals under suspicion.
So now that I've sidetracked us into areas that are no answers to whatsoever, where does Morrison stand now, and what potential liability are they looking at?
Well, Morrison's, I think, are trying to appeal to the Supreme Court. We'll see whether they can get there. They've appealed from the Court of Appeal. They, if the judgment stands, then there will be a assessment for quantum. So currently, the initial decisions have looked at potential liability, but haven't looked at how much each person gets. And of course, it could be the case that this 5,000, this 5% of the employee population, increases now that those initial claimants have had some success. So for Morrison's, it looks like, subject to any appeal they might make, that they're going to end up paying compensation to the employees, some of which, of course, are still with the business for this loss. And that's obviously upsetting to Morrison's. There's also a lot of debate in both court judgments on the availability of insurance, where effectively the court seemed to be saying that either Morrison's is covered by insurance for this, so they're at no direct loss, or they should have been. Now, whether that's an oversimplification of the cyber insurance market is for others to determine. I have my doubts as to whether if we're going to have concepts of vicarious liability, that's obviously going to have an impact on premiums and availability of cyber insurance. And people in some sectors, retail, for example, struggle to get cyber insurance as it is. So there's still a lot of questions to be answered, I think. And the next step will either be an appeal or a hearing on quantum, and we'll be in a bit better place to know the full effects after either of those two events.
Well, Jonathan, this has been a fascinating exploration of a case that now that you've really fully explained the details, I find even more, if not problematic, certainly concerning for corporate America, corporate UK, and perhaps corporations literally across the globe with the blurring of direct and vicarious liability. I would look forward to seeing what the United Kingdom Supreme Court might have to say.
Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Life with GDPR. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jonathan at jonathanarmstrong@Quarterly Compliance. I have a special announcement. Navex Global needs your expertise on ethics and compliance programs, and you're involved in the managing employee policies and procedures, hotline incident management, or training initiatives. Navex Global would like to hear from you for their 2019 Future of Compliance Survey. I'm going to link to the survey in the show notes. I hope you will complete the survey. For every survey completed, they will make a donation to one of several charities. This is Tom Fox. Life with GDPR is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.